The gas pump clicked. The afternoon sun caught the medals on his chest, turning the bronze and silver and gold into small fires that flickered with each subtle movement of his breathing. Navy Cross. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. 17 years of service to a country that had sent him into the darkest corners of the world and asked him to come back whole. 3 combat deployments. Missions classified so deep they would never see daylight. Scars that ached in cold weather and memories that surfaced unbidden in the quiet hours before dawn. And a police officer looked at all of that and saw one thing: a threat. What happened next was captured on video by a 15-year-old with a bag of chips and a phone in his hand. That video would end a police career, bring down a sitting state senator, and force an entire nation to answer one brutal, uncomfortable question. What does this country actually think of the men who bleed for it? This is not just a story about one traffic stop. This is not just a story about one man in uniform being humiliated at a gas pump while witnesses watched and cameras rolled. This is a story about what we refuse to see, even when it is pinned to someone's chest, even when it is earned in blood, even when it should be undeniable. 63 seconds. That is how long a man can stand at a gas pump before his entire life changes. 63 seconds between the moment he stepped out of his truck and the moment the cruiser door opened behind him. 63 seconds of a decorated war hero doing nothing more threatening than waiting for his tank to fill. The security camera at the BP station recorded every one of those seconds with a timestamp that would later become evidence. The timestamp did not lie. The timestamp did not have an agenda. The timestamp simply documented what happened, frame by frame, second by second, until there was no room left for interpretation. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened at that gas station on that ordinary afternoon, you need to understand who was standing at pump number 3. You need to understand the weight of those medals and the life that earned them. You need to understand the journey that brought Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed from the projects of Memphis to the ranks of the most elite fighting force in the world. And then you need to understand how easily all of that was dismissed by a man with a badge and a bias and absolutely no idea what he was about to destroy. Marcus Reed was 39 years old on the afternoon that would change everything. He stood 6'2" with the build of something carved rather than grown. His shoulders were broad, his posture naturally commanding, his movements carrying the economical precision of a man who had spent nearly 2 decades training his body to be a weapon and then learning with equal discipline when not to use it. His hair was cut close to his scalp, standard military regulation, with just the first faint dusting of gray appearing at the temples. His mother, Gloria Reed, liked to point this out every time she saw him, touching his face with both hands the way she had when he was 7 years old. "That is wisdom showing up, baby," she would say, her voice carrying the particular mixture of pride and sorrow that only mothers of soldiers truly understand. "That is the weight of everything you have carried." Gloria Reed knew about carrying weight. She had raised Marcus alone in the Riverside projects of Memphis, Tennessee, after his father James Reed died of a heart attack when Marcus was 11 years old. James had been a factory worker, a deacon at Mount Zion Baptist Church, and the kind of father who believed that showing up was the most important thing a man could do. He showed up for every basketball game, every parent-teacher conference, every Sunday dinner. And then one Tuesday morning his heart stopped while he was loading pallets onto a truck, and he never showed up again. Gloria had worked 2 jobs through most of Marcus's adolescence. Days at the elementary school where she was a teaching assistant, nights at the hospital where she cleaned rooms and changed linens and learned to sleep in fragments. She drove Marcus to every swim practice on the other side of town, the one at the community center that had a coach who actually knew what he was doing. She sat in the front row of his high school graduation. And 4 years later, she sat in the front row of his Bud/S graduation ceremony in Coronado, California, with tears streaming down her face and a hand pressed flat against her sternum like she was physically holding her heart inside her chest. Bud/S. Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training. The most demanding military training program in the world. Of the 187 candidates who started with Marcus's class, only 23 made it through. Marcus was one of them. He had earned it with every swimming stroke, every mile run in soft sand, every hour spent in the cold Pacific waters while instructors screamed at him to quit, to ring the bell, to give up and go home like a sensible person. He never rang the bell. 17 years of service to the United States Navy followed that graduation ceremony. 12 of those years as a SEAL assigned to SEAL Team 3 out of Coronado before his recent transfer to Joint Training Operations at Fort Campbell in Kentucky. 3 combat deployments, 2 in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. And 4 classified operations that he would carry to his grave without ever speaking of them. Not to his mother, not to his teammates, not to anyone. His dress uniform told parts of the story for those who knew how to read it. The Navy Cross pinned above his heart. That medal represented a night in Afghanistan that Marcus never talked about. A night when his team was ambushed during a compound raid in the Korengal Valley. A night when he had carried a wounded teammate named Rodriguez on his back for 2 miles through hostile territory, returning fire with one hand while the other kept pressure on a wound that was bleeding Rodriguez's life out onto the dirt trail. Rodriguez survived. He was medically retired now, living in San Diego with a wife and 2 daughters, and every year on the anniversary of that night he called Marcus and they sat on the phone together in silence for a while before saying goodbye. The Bronze Star with the Valor came from 3 separate actions under enemy fire. 3 moments when Marcus Reed had made decisions that kept other people alive at the cost of putting himself in harm's way. The citations were classified, the details would never be public, but the medal was real, and it meant something, and anyone who had served knew exactly what it meant. The Purple Heart represented the scar on his left side, the one that ached in cold weather. An IED explosion outside of Mosul. Shrapnel had torn through his body armor and lodged itself in places the surgeons had spent 6 hours removing. He had never told his mother how close it had been. Some things you protect the people you love from knowing. These were the medals that caught the afternoon light at the BP station. These were the decorations that would be pressed against the hood of his own truck while a police officer who had never heard a shot fired in anger ran his information through dispatch. These were the symbols of everything Marcus Reed had given to his country, displayed on his chest for anyone with eyes to see. And Officer Derek Vance had eyes, he just chose not to see. The morning before everything changed had started the way most of Marcus's mornings did, before the sun had any real business being up. By the time the sky had barely begun to lighten over Fort Campbell, Marcus had already completed a 6-mile run along the eastern edge of the base, the kind of run that most people would consider punishment. Marcus considered it prayer. It was the time of day when his mind was quiet, when the noise of the world had not yet crowded in, when he could exist simply as a body moving through cool air, a heartbeat, a pair of lungs working in rhythm. In those early morning miles, Marcus Reed was not a senior chief petty officer. He was not a statistic, he was not a symbol, he was not the face of anything larger than himself. He was just a man who loved his country with the kind of stubborn, aching devotion that most people only feel for their children or their gods. That love had been tested. It had been tested in combat zones where the rules of engagement sometimes felt designed by people who had never been in a firefight. It had been tested by a system that did not always honor the sacrifices it demanded. It had been tested by coming home to a country that sometimes seemed to have forgotten there was a war happening at all. But the love endured, complicated, sometimes painful, but enduring. The flag on his shoulder meant something to him that transcended politics or policy or any individual failure of the institutions that flew it. It meant something about who he was and who he had chosen to become. After his run, Marcus had showered, put on his dress uniform with careful attention to every detail, and driven to a middle school in Clarksville for a speaking engagement. He did these visits several times a year, quietly, with no press, no cameras, no official agenda, just him in a classroom full of kids who did not necessarily believe their lives could amount to anything extraordinary, and him standing there as evidence that they could. He always wore his dress uniform to these visits, not out of vanity, but because he had learned after years of doing this that children needed to see it. They needed to see what belonging to something larger than yourself looked like when it was draped across a real human body. They needed to see that the medals were real, that the ribbons were real, that the path from wherever they were to wherever they wanted to be was real. Even if it was hard, the school visit that morning had gone well. A 7th grade classroom at Douglas Middle School. 23 kids ranging from bored to skeptical to genuinely curious. Marcus had talked about discipline and purpose and the difference between giving up and pushing through. He had answered questions about training, about what it was like to jump from airplanes, about whether he had ever been scared. And then a 12-year-old named Darius had raised his hand, his eyes wide and absolutely serious, and asked whether seals were afraid of sharks. Marcus had crouched down to the boy's level, met his eyes directly, and said with equal seriousness, "The sharks are afraid of us." The classroom had erupted, 23 kids laughing and cheering and looking at him with something that had not been there before. It was the best moment of his week. He had shaken hands with the principal, posed for a photo with the class, and walked back to his truck with the particular satisfaction that came from doing something genuinely good with no expectation of reward or recognition. The drive back to Fort Campbell would take about 45 minutes. He was looking forward to getting back to base, changing into his working uniform, catching up on the administrative work that had piled up during his morning away. Then the low fuel light blinked on. Marcus pulled off the highway at the next exit and into a BP gas station on the edge of Clarksville. A normal afternoon, a normal errand, a man in uniform stopping for gas. Nothing about what followed was normal. The BP station sat at the intersection of 2 quiet roads, the kind of place that time seemed to have forgotten in all the ways that made small-town America simultaneously charming and unsettling. 4 pumps arranged in 2 rows, a small attached convenience store with a glass front and a bell that jingled when the door opened, A faded sign advertising boiled peanuts that had been bleached by the sun for so long that the words were more suggestion than statement. A rusted blue pickup was parked near the air pump at the far edge of the lot. The asphalt was cracked in places, patched in others, and held the particular stillness of a place where nothing much ever happened. On this afternoon, several people occupied this unremarkable space. A teenager in a red hoodie sat on the curb near the convenience store entrance, eating chips from a bag that crinkled with each handful. He was 15 years old, though he could have passed for older, with the wary, watchful posture of someone who had learned early to pay attention to his surroundings. His name was Darnell Washington. His father was an army mechanic stationed at Fort Campbell. Darnell had grown up around military families, around uniforms and deployments and homecomings, around the particular rhythms of base life. Near the air pump, an older white woman in a sun hat was loading grocery bags into the back of a silver minivan. Her name was Carol Mitchell. She was 62 years old, a retired nurse, and she had lived in Clarksville her entire life. She moved slowly, methodically, the way people move when they have nowhere urgent to be and nothing waiting for them except an empty house and the evening news. Inside the convenience store behind the counter, a man named Raymond Porter watched the pumps through the glass front window. He was 54, had owned this station for 18 years, and had seen enough in that time to develop an instinct for when something was about to go wrong. He could not have said what triggered that instinct on this particular afternoon. Something in the air, perhaps. Something in the way the light was falling. Or maybe just the accumulated weight of knowing that trouble did not announce itself with trumpets. It usually arrived dressed in the ordinary, wearing the face of any other day. Marcus Reed pulled his black Ford F-150 to pump number 3. He stepped out, stretched slightly after the 40 minutes of driving, and slid his card into the reader. The whole interaction from the moment he stepped out of the truck to the moment he first heard the police cruiser's door open behind him lasted exactly 63 seconds. He knew this because later it would be established by the gas station's security camera footage, which recorded with a timestamp 63 seconds of a man standing at a gas pump in full military dress uniform, medals catching the afternoon light, back straight, waiting for his tank to fill. 63 seconds of absolutely nothing threatening, nothing suspicious, nothing that should have attracted attention from anyone. But attention was coming. A Clarksville Police Department cruiser had pulled into the BP station from the opposite entrance. The officer inside had stopped to grab a coffee and a gas station sandwich, as he did most afternoons. But when he looked through his windshield and saw the man standing at pump 3, his plans changed. The cruiser sat idling for a long moment, then the engine cut off, then the door opened, and everything changed. Officer Derek Vance was 26 years old. He had been with the Clarksville Police Department for 2 years and 7 months. Not long enough to be considered a veteran, but long enough to believe he understood how the job worked. He was white, average height, with the kind of face that forgot itself the moment you stopped looking at it. Neither handsome nor homely, neither memorable nor distinctive. The kind of face that blended into crowds, that witnesses struggled to describe. That carried no particular character because character had not yet had time to etch itself into his features. According to colleagues who later spoke on background to journalists investigating the incident, Vance was not widely regarded as either a bad officer or a good one. He was, in the language of people who work in bureaucracies, a middle-of-the-pack guy. He followed rules when he felt like following them. He cut corners when he thought no one was watching. He had the particular combination of mediocrity and entitlement that often proves more dangerous than outright malice. His personnel file contained 2 minor complaints from his first year on the force. The first involved an aggressive stop of a Latino family on the highway, during which Vance had allegedly demanded identification from all 4 occupants, including 2 children, and had kept them on the roadside for 40 minutes while he ran checks that came back clean. The complaint had been filed by the father, a construction foreman named Miguel Santos, who described the stop as harassment pure and simple. The internal review found insufficient evidence of misconduct and closed the case. The second complaint involved Vance using unnecessarily rough language with a teenager during a curfew check. The teenager, a 16-year-old named Jalen Moore, claimed that Vance had called him a thug and told him he looked like trouble. Again, the internal review found insufficient evidence, and the case was closed. 2 complaints in 2 years, neither resulting in discipline, neither appearing on any record that the public could access. The kind of complaints that accumulated in files and were forgotten, unless and until they became part of a pattern that someone finally decided to see. What Derek Vance saw when he looked through his windshield at the BP station was a large black man standing at a gas pump. He told himself later that it was the man's posture that concerned him, that something about the way he stood seemed aggressive or threatening. He told himself he was just doing his job, just being cautious, just following instincts that any good officer would follow. He told himself a lot of things. The security camera told a different story entirely. It showed a man standing still, doing absolutely nothing, waiting for his gas to fill. A man who had not moved, had not made any gesture, had not so much as turned his head toward the approaching cruiser. A man whose only visible action in 63 seconds was checking the pump display once and then returning to his patient stillness. But Vance had already decided what he was seeing. He had decided before he stepped out of his cruiser. He had decided perhaps before he even pulled into the BP station. The decision was made. Everything else was just consequences. Derek Vance approached from behind. His hand rested near his sidearm. Not gripping it, but close enough that the intent was clear. His posture was aggressive, shoulders squared, chin lifted, moving with the kind of deliberate heaviness that certain men adopt when they want to seem more formidable than they actually are. Hey! Hey, stop! Do not move! The words cut across the quiet afternoon like stones thrown into still water. Several people turned toward the sound. Darnell Washington looked up from his chips. Carol Mitchell froze with a grocery bag suspended between her minivan and the cart. Raymond Porter moved closer to the window of his convenience store, something cold beginning to form in his stomach. Marcus Reed turned slowly, deliberately. The motion was controlled. Precise. The way a man turns when his reflexes are under conscious command and he knows that sudden movements in certain situations can get people killed. 20 years of training had taught him how to manage his body, how to telegraph non-threat, how to de-escalate through physicality alone. He faced the approaching officer. His hands were visible, loose at his sides, palms slightly forward in the universal gesture of peaceable intent. His face was neutral, carefully composed, revealing nothing of what was happening behind his eyes. "Good afternoon," Marcus said. His voice was calm, steady. The kind of voice that had talked men through firefights and kept teams focused when everything around them was chaos. It was the voice of authority but not aggression. The voice of someone accustomed to being in charge, but wise enough to know when showing that authority would make things worse. Officer Vance looked him up and down. His eyes moved over the uniform, tracking from the shoes up to the chest, pausing briefly on the rows of ribbons and medals, on the warfare insignia, on the gold trident pin that identified Marcus as a member of Naval Special Warfare. His gaze lingered there for a moment on that trident, which should have told him everything he needed to know about who he was dealing with. Then his eyes moved up to Marcus's face, and something in Vance's expression shifted. Not recognition, not understanding, something else. Something that looked a lot like resentment. "Can I see some ID?" "Step away from the vehicle." The words were commands, not questions. No explanation offered, no justification provided. Just demands delivered with the tone of someone who expected compliance and had never seriously considered what would happen if he did not receive it. Marcus did not immediately step away from the vehicle. Instead, he looked at the officer with the measured, assessing gaze of a man who had spent nearly 2 decades learning to read threats. He saw the hand near the sidearm. He saw the aggressive posture. He saw the flush beginning to color Vance's face, the frustration already building at the lack of instant obedience. "May I ask what this is about?" Marcus said. His voice remained calm. His hands remained visible. "I said step away from the vehicle and show me some ID. I am a United States Navy Senior Chief Petty Officer currently assigned to Fort Campbell." Marcus's tone was level. "Informational. I stopped to get gas. Can you tell me what the problem is?" The question hung in the air between them. It was a reasonable question. It was in fact exactly the question that any citizen had the right to ask when confronted by law enforcement. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution guaranteed protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. Reasonable, articulable suspicion was required for any Terry stop. Standing at a gas pump in a military uniform did not by any conceivable legal standard constitute suspicious activity. But Derek Vance was not interested in legal standards. He was interested in compliance. He was interested in control. And the man standing in front of him, despite being entirely cooperative, despite having done nothing wrong, was failing to offer either. Vance's jaw tightened. "Sir, I'm not going to ask you again." What happened next was witnessed by 4 people, each of whom would later provide statements to investigators, each of whom would carry the memory of that afternoon for the rest of their lives. Darnell Washington, the teenager in the red hoodie, had stopped eating his chips. He was watching with the particular attention of someone who had grown up in a world where encounters between black men and police officers did not always end peacefully. His phone was in his pocket. His hand was already moving toward it. Carol Mitchell, the woman with the sun hat, had set her grocery bag down on the edge of her cart. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding at pump 3. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones, the way you feel a storm coming before the first drops of rain. Raymond Porter had moved to the door of his convenience store. He stood there with one hand pressed over his mouth, watching through the glass. He had seen things in 18 years of running this station. He had seen arguments and fistfights, and once memorably a robbery attempt that ended with a man bleeding on his floor. But he had never seen anything quite like what was building in front of him now. And above them all, mounted on a post near the edge of the station's overhang, a security camera recorded everything. It captured each second with a timestamp, documenting the mundane reality of a man standing at a gas pump and the extraordinary injustice that was about to unfold. Officer Derek Vance reached out and grabbed Marcus Reed by the arm. The grip was tight, intentionally painful, the kind of grip designed to establish physical dominance and communicate that resistance would be met with escalation. It was the grip of someone who had done this before and expected it to work. Marcus went absolutely still. Any trained fighter will tell you that there are two kinds of stillness. There is the stillness of surrender, the slack-bodied resignation of someone who has given up and is simply waiting for whatever comes next. And there is the stillness of a coiled spring. The terrifying controlled tension of a man who could end the confrontation in 3 seconds and has decided consciously, deliberately, painfully not to. Marcus Reed was exhibiting the second kind of stillness. He could have broken this grip 6 different ways. He could have disabled this officer with a wrist lock or a sweep or a strike to any one of a dozen vulnerable points. He had spent years learning how to neutralize threats, how to control opponents, how to survive encounters with armed adversaries who were actively trying to kill him. This was not one of those encounters. This was something else entirely. This was a test of a different kind. And the skills that would win this particular battle were not the skills of combat, but the skills of witness, of documentation, of surviving the immediate moment so that justice could be pursued through proper channels. "I am not resisting," Marcus said. His voice carried across the quiet gas station lot. It was loud enough to be heard by everyone present, loud enough to be captured by the security camera's audio, loud enough to establish beyond any reasonable doubt exactly what was happening. "I am not resisting. My hands are visible. I am a United States military service member in uniform. I need you to state clearly why I am being detained." Vance's grip tightened. "You are being detained because I said so." "That is not a legal basis for detention," Marcus replied. His voice remained steady. His body remained still. His hands remained exactly where they had been. "I have committed no crime. I have made no threatening gesture or statement. I am asking you clearly and directly to tell me the legal basis for this detention." Vance's face flushed a deeper shade of red. He was not accustomed to this. He was not accustomed to suspects who knew their rights, who articulated them clearly, who failed to crumble under his authority. He was not accustomed to being challenged, and the challenge was making him angry. "You're acting suspicious," he spat. "I was standing at a gas pump. You matched the description of a suspect in a robbery that occurred on this block this morning." The words came out quickly, defensively, the verbal equivalent of a wild swing thrown by someone who knows they are losing. It was the first time Vance had mentioned any robbery. It was the first time he had offered any justification whatsoever for the stop. And it was, as would later be proven beyond any shadow of doubt, a complete and total fabrication. There had been no robbery on that block that morning. There had been no robbery anywhere in Clarksville that morning. The police dispatch logs subpoenaed weeks later through a public records request showed no robbery call, no bolo, no suspect description, nothing that could conceivably justify what was happening at this gas station. But Marcus did not know that yet. He could not prove in that moment that the officer was lying. All he could do was continue to stand there, continue to remain calm, continue to document his own compliance and the officer's escalation. "I would like to see your supervisor," Marcus said. Vance was already reaching for his radio. Within minutes, 2 more Clarksville Police Department cruisers had pulled into the BP station. They arrived without sirens, but with a kind of aggressive urgency, parking at angles that blocked the exits, positioning themselves in a way that suggested they were responding to something serious rather than a gas station traffic stop. The message was clear. This was now an event, something requiring backup, something potentially dangerous. The first cruiser belonged to Corporal Luis Reyes, a 7-year veteran of the department. Reyes was 34 years old, Latino, compact and muscular, with dark eyes that took in a scene the way a camera does, all at once, cataloging details, noting discrepancies, building a picture. He had been a good officer once, maybe still was, though the compromises of the job had worn grooves into his conscience that he tried not to examine too closely. He stepped out of his cruiser and immediately felt something was wrong. The feeling was physical, a cold sensation in his stomach, an instinctive recognition that he had walked into a situation that was not what it appeared to be. He looked at the man standing by the black Ford F-150, and his eyes tracked over the uniform, the medals, the rows of ribbons, the gold trident pin. He knew what that trident meant. He had cousins in the Marines. He had grown up around military culture, around the particular respect that was accorded to those who served in the most demanding roles. He knew that the man standing at that gas pump, the man his fellow officer had apparently detained, was not any ordinary service member. Something cold moved through Corporal Reyes. He said nothing. The second cruiser belonged to Officer Carla Patterson, 29 years old, in her first year out of field training. She stayed near her vehicle, her posture uncertain, her eyes moving between Vance and the detained man and the growing number of witnesses. She had not yet learned how to intervene when a senior officer was doing something wrong. She was not sure she ever would. 3 officers now, 3 police vehicles blocking the gas station lot. A decorated Navy SEAL standing with his hands visible while his commanding officer's medals caught the afternoon light. And on the curb, invisible to everyone who mattered, Darnell Washington had his phone out. He had been recording for several minutes already. His hands were shaking, but the phone was steady. He knew what he was seeing. He knew it needed to be documented. He kept recording. Now emboldened by the presence of backup officer Derek Vance, escalated. Hands on the hood of the vehicle. Spread your legs. Now! The order was delivered with increased aggression. The voice of a man who had been embarrassed by the initial resistance and was determined to reassert his authority. He still had his grip on Marcus's arm, and he used it now to push, to direct, to physically compel compliance. Marcus allowed himself to be moved toward the truck. The calculation was running in his mind. The same calculation that black men in America learned to make from the moment they were old enough to understand the particular dangers they faced. The calculation between dignity and survival. The calculation that asked, what is this moment worth? And what might resistance cost? He could fight. Every fiber of his training screamed at him to resist, to neutralize the threat, to take control of the situation in the way he had been taught. But this was not a combat zone. These were not enemy combatants. These were American police officers. And fighting them even in clear self-defense could end with bullets in his body and his name on a headstone. He chose survival. He would deal with dignity later. His hands made contact with the hood of his truck. The metal was warm from the afternoon sun, smooth beneath his palms. He spread his stance slightly, assuming the position, feeling the profound wrongness of it settle into his bones. The Navy Cross pressed against the warm metal. That metal represented the night in Afghanistan, the 2-mile carry through hostile territory. The blood of his teammate Rodriguez soaking through his uniform while he returned fire and moved and refused to stop until they reached the extraction point. It represented a choice to risk everything for a brother in arms, a choice that most people would never face and could never understand. Now it was pressed against the hood of a Ford F-150 at a BP gas station in Tennessee. The Bronze Star with Valor settled beside it. 3 separate actions under enemy fire. 3 moments when Marcus Reed had made decisions that kept other people alive at the cost of putting himself in harm's way. The citations were classified. The details would never be public. But the medal was real, and it meant something. And it was being ground into the hood of his own vehicle by the weight of his body as a police officer conducted a pat-down search that had no legal justification whatsoever. The Purple Heart pressed into the metal as well. The scar on his left side seemed to pulse with phantom pain, as if responding to the indignity of the moment. He had nearly died for this country. He had bled for it, had given pieces of himself that would never grow back, had made sacrifices that most citizens would never know about because the work he did was classified and would remain classified until long after he was dead. And here he was, hands on the hood of his truck, being searched like a criminal. While witnesses watched and cameras rolled and the afternoon sun continued to shine with complete indifference, Carol Mitchell's voice cut across the station lot, trembling with something that sounded like fury. "This is wrong. This is wrong what you are doing." Officer Vance glanced in her direction. "Ma'am, please stay back. I will not stay back." Carol's voice rose, carrying the particular power of someone who had been silent for too long and could no longer contain what was building inside her. "That man is in uniform. He has medals on his chest. What is wrong with you?" Vance's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, if you interfere with a police investigation, I will arrest you for obstruction." But Carol Mitchell was not a frightened woman. She was 62 years old and she had lived in Clarksville her whole life, and she had seen enough to know injustice when it was standing right in front of her. She stayed where she was, groceries forgotten, watching, bearing witness. Inside the convenience store, Raymond Porter had his own phone out now. His hands were steadier than Darnell's, but his heart was racing just as fast. He documented everything through the glass, making sure there would be another angle, another record, another piece of evidence that could not be denied. And on the curb, Darnell Washington kept filming. His father was Army. His uncle had been Army. He had grown up understanding what military service meant, what the ribbons and medals represented, what it cost to earn the kind of decorations that were now pressed against that truck hood. He was 15 years old and he was watching something that he knew with absolute certainty was deeply and fundamentally wrong. His hands had stopped shaking. The phone was steady. He kept recording. While still filming, Darnell managed to do something that would later be recognized as a crucial turning point in everything that followed. Without looking away from the scene, without lowering his phone, he used his other hand to dial his father's number. "Dad," he said when the call connected. His voice was urgent but controlled, the voice of someone trying to relay important information quickly. "Dad, you need to listen to me. They have got a guy in uniform at the BP on 76th. Dad, I think he's a SEAL. They have got him hands on his truck. You need to call somebody." On the other end of the line, Airman First Class Calvin Washington listened to his son's words and felt something cold seize his chest. He knew that gas station. He drove past it on his way to base every day. He knew what SEAL Team Trident pins looked like because he had seen them on the men who sometimes came through Fort Campbell for joint training operations. And he knew with the particular knowledge of a black man who had spent his entire adult life in the military exactly what his son was describing. "Stay on the line," Calvin told his son. "Stay safe. Do not get involved. Just keep recording." Then he pulled up the Fort Campbell duty officer's number and made a call that would set in motion a chain of events that no one at that gas station could have predicted. The duty officer, a lieutenant commander named Warren Price, answered on the second ring. Calvin explained what his son was seeing in quick, precise terms. Price asked several questions, his voice growing more serious with each answer. Then he thanked Calvin and hung up. His next call was to Commander Reginald Voss. Commander Voss was driving back to Fort Campbell from a meeting at the base when his phone rang. He was 12 minutes away from the BP station. After hearing what Lieutenant Commander Price had to tell him, he covered that distance in 8. Back at the gas station, time had begun to move with the strange elasticity that accompanies moments of crisis. For Marcus Reed, the minutes stretched into something that felt like hours. He stood with his hands on the hood of his truck, feeling the weight of the metals pressing into the warm metal. Listening to Officer Vance's radio in his information and request backup checks. He heard the crackle of the dispatch response, the flat electronic voice confirming that the license and registration were clean, that there were no warrants, that the vehicle was registered to one Marcus A. Reed of Fort Campbell, Kentucky. There was a pause. Even through the radio static, Marcus could hear the confusion in the dispatcher's voice as she processed the information that was coming back. The military affiliation, the rank, the lack of any criminal history whatsoever. Unit 714, be advised. Subject shows as active duty Navy rank, Senior Chief Petty Officer currently assigned to Fort Campbell. No warrants, no priors, no wants. Vance's jaw tightened. This was not what he had expected. This was not what he had wanted. He had been so certain, so absolutely convinced, that this black man standing at a gas pump represented something criminal, something suspicious, something that would justify his instincts and validate his actions. The reality was forcing itself through the walls of his assumptions, and he did not know what to do with it, but he could not back down now. Not in front of his fellow officers, not in front of the witnesses, not after he had already committed to this course of action so publicly and so aggressively. "Continue the pat down," Vance muttered, more to himself than anyone else. And so he did. Corporal Reyes stood 3 feet away and watched. Something was building in his chest. Something that felt like shame mixed with the terrible knowledge that he should be intervening and was not. He knew this was wrong. He had known it from the moment he arrived and saw the trident pin, the Navy cross, the rows of ribbons that spoke of service and sacrifice beyond anything he had ever experienced. But he said nothing. He would carry that silence for a long time. Officer Patterson stood near her cruiser, her posture uncertain, her eyes moving from face to face as if searching for some guidance about what she should do. She was new. She was uncertain. She was afraid of getting it wrong, and so she did nothing, which was its own kind of wrong. The witnesses continued to watch. Carol Mitchell's hands were clenched into fists at her sides. Raymond Porter had stopped filming and was now simply staring, his face a mask of horror and helpless rage. Darnell Washington kept his phone steady, kept recording, kept documenting what should never have had to be documented. And then a black government SUV tore into the parking lot. The vehicle came in fast, engine roaring, and stopped at a hard angle near the pumps. Everyone turned. Officer Vance's hand froze mid-motion, caught in the act of running along Marcus's side as if searching for weapons that did not exist. Corporal Reyes took an instinctive step backward. Officer Patterson's hand moved toward her sidearm before she caught herself and forced it back down. The SUV door opened, and a figure stepped out that only Marcus Reed immediately recognized. He knew the shoes first. Polished, military standard, moving across the pavement with a particular gait that spoke of decades of service. He knew the way the man carried himself, the squared shoulders, the absolute composure. The physical presence of someone who had coordinated extractions in active combat zones and never lost his nerve. Commander Reginald Voss, United States Navy, Marcus's commanding officer at Fort Campbell's Joint Training Division. Voss was 54 years old, stocky, silver-haired, with a face that looked like a topographic map of every difficult decision he had ever made. He had served for 31 years. He had commanded men in combat. He had written letters to families that began with the words that no family ever wanted to read. He had earned every line on his face and every gray hair on his head, and he carried himself with the particular authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. He walked toward the scene with measured steps, taking in everything, The officers, the witnesses, the man with his hands on the truck hood, the medals catching the afternoon light. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. So quiet that every person at that BP station fell silent just to hear it. Officer. Vance straightened reflexively at the tone, at the command presence, at the Silver Eagle insignia that marked Voss's rank. He was not military, but he recognized authority when he encountered it. What is the basis of this detention? The question hung in the air. Vance opened his mouth to respond, and the words that came out were the same words he had been telling himself all along. This individual was acting suspicious. This individual, Voss interrupted, his voice not rising but somehow becoming more dangerous, is Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed, United States Navy. He paused, letting that sink in. He is the holder of the Navy Cross, the Bronze Star with Valor, the Purple Heart, and the Distinguished Service Medal. He is currently assigned under my direct command. He has more documented combat hours than you have days in that uniform. The words landed like blows. Vance's face went through 3 colors in as many seconds. Red to white to gray. His hand still hovering near Marcus's side began to tremble. He started. I have been on the phone with your department's dispatch for the last several minutes. Voss continued, his voice carrying the flat clinical precision of a man delivering an after-action report. There was no robbery on this block this morning. There was no bolo. There was no suspect description. There was nothing. He took another step closer. There was nothing except a black man standing at a gas pump in a uniform that should have told you everything you needed to know about who he was. And you chose not to see it. The silence that followed was the loudest silence anyone at that BP station had ever heard. Corporal Reyes had taken several steps back now. His face had gone pale, and something in his eyes looked like the beginning of understanding, the beginning of reckoning with what he had witnessed and what he had failed to do. Officer Patterson stood frozen by her cruiser, her hand nowhere near her weapon, her posture communicating surrender to whatever was about to happen. And Officer Derek Vance stood in front of Commander Voss, his fabricated justifications crumbling around him, the reality of what he had done beginning to penetrate the walls he had built around his conscience. Say his name, Voss commanded. Vance blinked. What? I want you to say his name, out loud, so everyone here can hear it. The gas station was absolutely silent, the security camera recorded. Darnell Washington's phone captured every second. The witnesses held their breath. Senior Chief! Vance's voice cracked. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed, and what are those medals on his chest? Vance's eyes dropped to the ribbons, to the decorations, to the symbols of sacrifice that he had looked at and dismissed and ignored. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. That is the Navy Cross, Voss said, pointing. That is the Bronze Star with Valor. That is the Purple Heart. And you put your hands on him. At a gas pump. Because he was pumping gas. The words hung in the afternoon air like a verdict already delivered. I will be contacting the Secretary of the Navy. Voss continued. I will be contacting the Department of Justice. I will be requesting a formal investigation by your department's Internal Affairs Division and if necessary by federal authorities. Every piece of footage from this station will be preserved. Every witness statement will be collected. And you, officer, will answer for what you have done here today. He turned to Marcus. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. The language of men who have been through things that cannot be explained in words. A language built from shared experience and mutual respect, and the particular grief of having to keep fighting battles that should have been won long ago. You all right, Senior Chief? Marcus straightened up from the hood of his truck. He smoothed his jacket. He adjusted the line of his medals, making sure they hung correctly despite everything that had just happened. Yes, sir, he said. I am all right. But he was not. Not really, and Voss knew it. And that knowledge settled between them like a stone that would take years to lift. What nobody at the BP station knew, what nobody would know for another several days, was who had been sitting in the silver sedan parked at the far end of the lot since before any of this began. State Senator William Greer of Tennessee had pulled in to use the restroom before a campaign stop. He was 61 years old, white, with the carefully maintained appearance of a man who understood that politics was largely about looking the part. His hair was silver and professionally styled. His suit was expensive but not ostentatiously so. His smile in campaign photos suggested warmth and trustworthiness, qualities that his actual record did not consistently support. Greer was up for re-election in November. He was publicly a vocal supporter of law enforcement, a critic of what he called anti-police rhetoric. A man who had built a significant portion of his political identity around backing the blue. He gave speeches at church halls and county fairs about how officers were being unfairly maligned, about how the media was manufacturing narratives, about how the real problem in America was not police misconduct but the people who dared to question police authority. He had watched the entire incident from his car. His aide, a young woman named Cassidy Pham, had been sitting beside him in the passenger seat. She had seen what was happening and had said, "Senator, should we—" And William Greer, state senator, defender of law enforcement, man who built his career on backing the blue, had said, "Let us just see how this plays out." He had watched Officer Vance grab Marcus Reed by the arm. He had watched a decorated Navy SEAL in full dress uniform be pushed against his own truck and patted down like a criminal. He had watched Commander Voss arrive and deliver his devastating confrontation. He had watched justice begin to assert itself. And then he had started his car and attempted to leave. He was not successful. A young woman stepped directly in front of his vehicle before he could clear the parking lot. She was small, 5'3", with dark hair and sharp eyes and the particular energy of someone who was not accustomed to being intimidated. Her name was Kira Brennan. She was 28 years old, a reporter for the Nashville Banner. She had been following the Clarksville Police Department's complaint history for months, working on a story about patterns of racially biased stops in Montgomery County. She had a police scanner in her car, and she had been blocks away when the dispatch traffic had spiked with the call for backup at the BP station. She had arrived with her recorder running just in time to capture Commander Voss's confrontation with Officer Vance, and she had recognized State Senator Greer's silver sedan the moment she saw it, because she had photographed that same car in the parking lots of 3 campaign events she had covered. "Senator Greer," she said, standing in front of his vehicle with her recorder held visible. "Did you observe this incident from beginning to end?" Greer's window came down a few inches. His face was carefully composed, but something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or fear. "Miss, I do not think this is the time. Senator, you have been a visible and vocal supporter of the Clarksville Police Department. A decorated Navy SEAL was just detained without cause at this gas station. Did you see it?" A pause that lasted several seconds, long enough to be its own answer. "I observed a police officer doing his job." "Did you observe that officer fabricate a robbery report as justification for a stop that had none?" Another pause. "I think you had better speak to the department directly." "Senator, with respect, I am speaking to you. You were here. You saw the whole thing." Kira's voice hardened slightly. "And you were about to drive away without saying anything." The window went back up, but by then 3 other people had their phone cameras pointed at his car. Darnell Washington had captured the entire exchange. Carol Mitchell had her own phone out now recording. Even Raymond Porter had emerged from the convenience store with his camera raised. Senator William Greer sat in his vehicle for a long moment, surrounded by witnesses and cameras, his career already beginning to burn around him, though he did not yet know it. Then he drove away. It would be the last time he drove away from anything without consequence. Darnell Washington posted his video while he was still sitting on the curb of the BP station. He added no caption. He added no commentary. He added no context beyond what the footage itself provided. He simply uploaded it and let it speak for itself. Seconds of footage. A Navy SEAL in full dress uniform with his hands on his truck while a police officer stood behind him. The medals clearly visible. Catching the afternoon light, the expression on Marcus Reed's face. That terrible controlled stillness. Clearly visible. The moment Officer Vance's hand pushed between Marcus's shoulder blades to keep him in place. That was the moment. That was the footage that would change everything. By evening, the video had hundreds of thousands of views. The algorithms had taken notice. The shares were multiplying exponentially. People were watching, rewatching, sharing with comments that ranged from horrified to enraged to simply heartbroken. By morning, the clip was on every major network and every major print outlet in the country. Darnell Washington's 15-year-old face appeared on morning shows alongside his father, Airman First Class Calvin Washington. The boy sat in front of the cameras with a composure that belied his age, answering questions with a seriousness that made the anchors visibly emotional. "I just knew it was wrong," Darnell said when asked why he had decided to record. "I could see his medals. Everybody could see his medals. I grew up around military families. I know what those decorations mean. I do not understand how you look at that and decide he is a threat." The military community reacted with an outrage that cut across every demographic line. Veterans of every branch, every age, every background posted in solidarity. Active duty service members, carefully in ways that did not violate the UCMJ, made their feelings clear. Gold Star families shared the video with comments about what it meant to sacrifice for a country that could treat its warriors this way. The hashtag #StandWithSeniorChief Reed trended nationwide for days. Naval Special Warfare Command released a formal statement expressing their profound concern and their full support for Senior Chief Petty Officer Reed. The Secretary of the Navy made a personal phone call to Marcus's phone. He missed it, because in the hours after the incident, Marcus Reed had driven back to base, changed out of his dress uniform, folded it carefully, set it on a chair, sat on the edge of his bed, and stared at the wall for a long time. Then he called his mother. "Mama," he said when Gloria Reed picked up. She heard the sound of his voice and went quiet in the way that mothers do when they have been dreading a phone call for years and finally understand they were right to dread it. "Tell me," she said. And he did. When he finished, Gloria Reed was silent for a moment. Marcus could hear her breathing through the phone, could picture her sitting in the living room of her house in Memphis, surrounded by the photographs of his life that she had accumulated over 39 years. Then she said something that Marcus would carry with him for the rest of his life. "Baby, I want to tell you something and I need you to hear it. I am listening. They could not take a single thing from you today. Not one medal. Not one mission. Not one moment of who you are. You understand? They could grab your arm. They could push you down. They could press your medals against that truck hood. But everything that matters, every single thing that makes you Marcus Reed, they could not touch." Her voice broke slightly, then rebuilt itself in real time. "I raised you to be unbreakable, and you were. You held it together even when you did not have to, even when nobody would have blamed you for losing your composure. That is not weakness, Marcus. That is the strongest thing I have ever seen." Marcus did not say anything for a long time. He just listened to his mother breathe, feeling something release in his chest that had been coiled tight since the moment he saw that cruiser pull into the BP station. "Come home soon," Gloria said. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied. It was the closest he had come to crying since Rodriguez had nearly died in his arms in that valley in Afghanistan. The consequences came the way consequences always come when the world is paying attention, fast and without mercy. The Clarksville Police Department placed Officer Derek Vance on administrative leave within hours of the video going viral. Chief Raymond Boswell, a heavy-set man in his mid-50s who had been with the department for 23 years and was months from retirement, called a press conference where he stood before a room bristling with cameras and said in a voice that carried the weight of a man choosing his words on a very narrow ledge that the department had serious concerns about the stop, that the officer's stated justification was inconsistent with dispatch records, and that a full investigation had been launched. A reporter from the AP asked directly, "Chief Boswell, did Officer Vance lie about the reason for the stop?" Boswell looked at the cameras for a long moment. "The investigation will establish the facts," he said. "The investigation established the facts in days. There was no robbery. There was no BOLO. There was no call. The dispatch records were clean." Vance's own in-car camera, which he had claimed was malfunctioning, was later found by department technicians to have been manually disabled minutes before he pulled into the BP station. He had driven past the station twice before stopping, which the traffic cameras on the highway caught. He had watched Marcus pull in. He had waited. The Internal Affairs report concluded that Vance had conducted a pretextual stop with no lawful basis, subsequently fabricated a justification, and intentionally disabled his in-car recording equipment in advance. The report further noted that this was consistent with a documented pattern, referencing the 2 earlier complaints and 3 additional incidents that had never risen to the level of formal complaints but were noted in his personnel file. Derek Vance was terminated from the Clarksville Police Department weeks after the incident. He was informed of his termination by a written notice delivered to his home address. He did not come to the door when it was delivered. His wife Linda accepted it in the doorway with an expression that people who saw her later described as someone who had known this was coming for a long time. The Montgomery County District Attorney, a woman named Barbara Howell who had been in office for years and who did not make decisions lightly, announced weeks after the termination that she was convening a grand jury to consider criminal charges against Vance for filing a false police report and civil rights violations. The grand jury returned an indictment in weeks. Derek Vance was arraigned on a cold morning exactly weeks after that afternoon at a gas pump. He entered a plea of not guilty. His attorney, a local defense lawyer named Gary Pitts, told reporters outside the courthouse that the charges were politically motivated and that his client had been sacrificed on the altar of public opinion. Kira Brennan wrote a feature on the indictment. It won a Tennessee Press Association award. The consequences did not stop with Vance. Corporal Luis Reyes submitted a formal written statement to Internal Affairs weeks after the incident. In it, he stated that he had arrived at the scene, observed the detention, assessed it immediately as unjustified, and failed to intervene. He wrote, "I am not able to say that I did not know better, because I did. I recognized that man's uniform. I recognized his rank and his decorations. I stood there and I said nothing, and I have to live with that." He also resigned from the Clarksville Police Department days later. Not because he was forced to. The Internal Affairs report did not recommend his termination. He resigned because, as he said in the handwritten letter he left on Chief Boswell's desk, "I do not know how to be the kind of officer I want to be inside a system where this was possible and where I responded to it the way I did. I need to figure that out somewhere else." Reyes moved back to San Antonio. He enrolled in a social work program the following spring. Officer Carla Patterson, who had stood by her cruiser and done nothing, was placed in mandatory counseling and retraining. She remained on the force. In a department memo that was never meant to be public, but found its way to Kira Brennan's inbox by an anonymous source, she had written, "I keep seeing his face, the way he just stood there. I knew it was wrong, and I was scared, and that is not good enough. It was not, but it was honest. State Senator William Greer's political troubles began the same week the Nashville Banner published the video of him being questioned by Kira Brennan in his car. The clip of his window going up, of him choosing silence over accountability, of him driving away, played on loops in political coverage across the state. His primary challenger, a younger candidate named Patricia Ortega, who had served as a public defender for years, began closing the gap in polls almost immediately. By the election, she had pulled ahead. Greer lost the election on the first Tuesday in November. He carried a lower percentage of the vote than any incumbent in the district's history. In his concession statement, he made no mention of the incident. He said only that he was proud of his service and wished his successor well. Nobody believed him. His aide Cassidy Pham quit days after the Nashville Banner story ran and was hired months later as a communications director for a veterans advocacy organization. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed did not watch the video, not once. Not the original clip, not the news segments, not the compilations, not the reaction videos. He was told about all of it. He understood the scope of what had happened. He did not watch it. He returned to duty the Monday after the incident. He went to the gym. He swam. He briefed his team. He ate in the mess hall and read after lights out and did all the ordinary things that form the architecture of a military life. Commander Reginald Voss checked in with him daily for the first week. Not with fanfare, not with speeches. He would appear in the doorway of whatever room Marcus was in and say something like, "How is your PT?" or "You eating enough?" Or once memorably, "Your mother called the base." And Marcus would say something like, "I am good, sir," and mean it about 70% of the time. And Voss would nod and leave. And neither of them would say what they meant, because men who have been through hard things together do not always need to. Marcus agreed after weeks and a conversation with Gloria Reed that lasted hours to give one interview. It was with Kira Brennan. They met at a diner in Clarksville on a Wednesday afternoon. Kira arrived early. Marcus arrived on time in civilian clothes, jeans, a grey pullover, white sneakers. He looked without the uniform like a man who was working very hard to be ordinary. They talked for hours. Kira's recorder ran the whole time. She ordered coffee. He ordered coffee and a slice of pie that he ate half of. The profile she wrote, published weeks later in The Atlantic as well as the Nashville Banner, was titled "The Weight of What You Have Earned." It opened with a description of his medals and then moved through his life. His mother, his father's death, Bud/S, his deployments, his visits to middle schools, and arrived at the afternoon at the BP station with the precision of someone who understood that the story's meaning lay not in the incident itself, but in the years of sacrifice that made the incident so unbearable. The piece went viral twice, once when it was published, and once the following month when it was read aloud by a veteran podcaster with a massive audience who stopped midway through the reading and had to take a break to collect himself. Marcus called Kira after the piece came out. He said, "You got it right." She said, "I tried." He said, "I know." They both went quiet for a moment and then he said, "Thank you." And she said, "Thank you for talking to me." And that was that. Derek Vance's trial began the following March on a morning so cold and grey that the courthouse steps were glazed with a thin skin of overnight frost. People arrived early anyway. They lined the hallway outside the courtroom an hour before the doors opened. Veterans in unit hats, community members in winter coats, a handful of reporters balancing coffee cups and press credentials. Not all of them could get seats. The ones who could not stood in the corridor and followed the proceedings through the murmur that filtered through the heavy wooden doors. Inside the courtroom had the particular feeling of a room that understood its own importance. The light through the tall windows was flat and wintry and unforgiving. The kind of light that stripped away pretense and left things exactly as they were. The prosecution was led by Assistant DA Renee Chambers. Sharp, methodical, unhurried. She had tried many civil rights cases in her career and had learned through hard experience that juries do not always vote with their hearts when they are asked to convict a police officer. Emotion was a door that could swing both ways, so she did not appeal to it. She built her case the way a carpenter builds a frame, piece by piece, joint by joint. Nothing ornamental, everything load-bearing. She gave them the dispatch logs, clean. No robbery call, no BOLO, no suspect description, nothing. She gave them the traffic camera footage from the highway, Vance's cruiser passing the BP station twice before pulling in. The timestamps minutes apart. She gave them the in-car recorder, which department technicians had confirmed was manually disabled minutes before Vance arrived at the station. Not malfunctioning, disabled. The distinction mattered, and Chambers let it sit in the room without commentary. Let the jury do the arithmetic themselves. She gave them the 2 prior complaints from Vance's personnel file and the 3 additional incidents that had never risen to the level of formal grievance but existed in the record like old bruises. And then she gave them people. Raymond Porter took the stand in a dark sport coat that he had pressed carefully, and he described in measured and precise language what he had seen through the convenience store window that afternoon. He did not editorialize. He did not perform. He simply told the truth in the order it had happened, and the truth was enough. Carol Mitchell sat in the witness box in her Sunday clothes and held the arms of the chair as though steadying herself against something. When she spoke, her voice shook, not with fear, but with the kind of fury that has been sitting in a person for months looking for an authorized exit. He was in full uniform. She said, "He had more medals on his chest than I have ever seen on a person, and that officer treated him like he was nothing." The courtroom was very quiet after that. Commander Reginald Voss took the stand in his dress uniform, silver and squared and immovable, and was asked simply to describe what he had found when he arrived at the gas station that afternoon. He described it without passion, without theater. In the flat and documented voice of a man accustomed to writing incident reports in conditions that did not allow for emotion, he listed what he had seen, what he had said, what he had been told by dispatch in the minutes before he arrived. He named Marcus's decorations by their full titles. He described the position Marcus's hands were in, the placement of Vance's hand on Marcus's shoulder blades, the expression on Vance's face when he turned and saw the uniform of a superior officer. It was the detachment of it that devastated the room. There was no grief in Voss's voice because he had caged it somewhere far back, and the cage was visible, and that was worse than tears would have been. The defense tried several angles. The attorney argued that Vance had been acting on a genuine perceived threat. He argued that the video had poisoned the jury pool beyond the possibility of fairness. He called a use of force expert who worked methodically through a framework that attempted to characterize Vance's behavior as consistent with departmental training guidelines. Renee Chambers cross-examined him for minutes. She was not aggressive, she was not theatrical. She simply worked through his testimony with the exhausted efficiency of a surgeon performing a familiar procedure. And when she was done, the framework he had constructed had been dismantled so thoroughly and so quietly that several jurors were looking at their notepads rather than the witness. Marcus Reed did not testify. He had made that decision calmly after a long conversation with his own attorney, grounded in the belief that the facts did not need his voice to give them weight. He sat in the gallery on the first day of the trial, and he sat there on the last. He wore civilian clothes both times, dark jeans, a simple jacket, nothing to signal or announce himself. He watched with the same controlled attention he brought to everything. He did not look away. On the final day, when the jury filed back in after hours of deliberation, Vance sat at the defense table and did not look at Marcus. He looked at his hands. He looked at the table. He looked at the particular nowhere that people look at when they already know what is coming and are trying to decide how to survive the moment it arrives. The foreperson stood. The courtroom inhaled, guilty on both counts, filing a false police report and interference with constitutional rights under color of law. The room did not erupt. There were no cheers, no dramatic outbursts. What happened instead was something quieter and more complete. A collective exhale, the sound of people releasing something they had been holding for months. Someone near the back was crying. A veteran near the aisle pressed his fist to his mouth. Vance was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised probation, and a permanent ban from serving in law enforcement. He did not speak during sentencing. His attorney spoke for him in language that was measured and hollow and made very little impression on anyone in the room. Marcus Reed heard the verdict and felt not triumph, not the clean release he might have imagined during the long months of waiting. He felt something more complicated and more honest than satisfaction, a grief that was not only his own, a weight that extended backward through time to every man who had stood where he stood without a video, without a commander arriving in a government SUV, without a teenager on a curb with the courage to press record. The ones whose names were not hashtags, the ones whose cases were not verdicts. He felt them in the room with him, and he held that weight, and he did not put it down. He carried it out of the courthouse into the pale spring afternoon where his teammate Senior Chief Tyrell Banks was already at the curb, truck idling, engine warm. Banks looked at him. He did not ask for a speech. "How do you feel?" he said. Marcus stood for a moment in the thin sunlight and let the air touch his face. "Like it is not over," he said. Banks thought about it, nodded slowly. "You are right," he said. "It is not." They drove back to base. The river ran alongside the highway, silver and indifferent, moving in the only direction water knows how to move. Months after the incident, on a cold December morning, Marcus Reed drove back to the BP station on the highway. He did not entirely know why. The gas station had no particular significance to him beyond what had happened there. It was not a meaningful place. It was not somewhere he had ever had a reason to stop before. It was just a BP station with 4 pumps and a faded sign about boiled peanuts. But he drove there anyway, pulled up to pump number 3, and stood in the cold morning air while his tank filled. The station was different now. Raymond Porter had printed out a photograph, the one that had circulated the most, showing Marcus standing with his medals caught in the afternoon light, and mounted it in a simple black frame behind the counter with a small handwritten note taped beneath it. "American hero, always welcome here." Marcus did not know about the photo until he went inside to pay cash. He stood at the counter and looked at himself. at the version of himself from that afternoon in full dress uniform, impossibly still, and for a moment he did not say anything. Raymond Porter watched him from behind the counter with the careful, compassionate attention of a man who has thought about another person's pain many times and is now in the presence of it. "That is a good man in that picture," Raymond said quietly. Marcus looked at him. Something shifted in his face. Something released just slightly, like a door that had been held closed for a long time with great effort. "I appreciate that," he said. "He paid for his gas." He shook Raymond's hand. He drove back to base through a winter morning that was gray and bright and quiet. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed served 3 more years in the United States Navy before receiving an honorable discharge at the age of 42. He settled in Memphis close to his mother. He now runs a non-profit organization co-founded with Commander Reginald Voss, who retired the year after Marcus. They called it the Trident Foundation, which provides legal resources, counseling, and advocacy for military veterans who have experienced discrimination or rights violations. Darnell Washington, the teenager on the curb, received a personal letter from Marcus months after the verdict. In it, Marcus told him that courage does not require a sealed trident age or rank, and that what Darnell had done, standing up, pressing record, refusing to look away, had mattered more than he knew. Darnell is now enrolled at Tennessee State studying journalism. His professor in his first media ethics class keeps a printout of the original video still on her office door with a note that reads, "This is why it matters." The medals Marcus Reed wore that afternoon at the gas pump are now displayed in a shadow box in his mother Gloria's living room in Memphis. The Navy Cross, the Bronze Star with Valor, the Purple Heart. She looks at them every morning with her coffee. They represent everything her son gave to his country, and they represent the afternoon when his country almost forgot what he had given, almost. But a 15-year-old boy with a phone and the courage to press record made sure the world remembered. Sometimes courage looks like a Navy SEAL. Sometimes it looks like a teenager on a curb with a half-eaten bag of chips. Both versions matter. Both versions saved something that day. What happened at that BP station was not just one man's story. It was a mirror held up to something much larger, a test of who we are and what we refuse to look away from. Marcus Reed carried 17 years of sacrifice into a gas station and was made to feel like a criminal. And yet he never cracked, never lowered himself to the level of what was being done to him. He stood straight, kept his hands visible, and trusted that the truth would do its job if people were watching. And people were watching because a 15-year-old kid had the courage to press record. That is the lesson. Courage does not always look like a Navy SEAL. Sometimes it looks like a teenager on a curb with a half-eaten bag of chips. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, then do not let it stop here. Hit like, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who needs to see it. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time. Because this is what we do here. We tell the stories that matter. The ones that make you feel awake and alive and accountable. Subscribe to our channel. We will see you in the next one.